All right. Hi, everybody. I am just going to wait a few more moments. It looks like our room, as it were, is populating and filling up. And I don't want to, as you know, this is that moment when people are walking into the hall and there's nervous conversation. And I'm going to let that conversation unfold. Wait a few more moments for people to join. All righty. Looks like we have stabilized. So I'm going to get us started so we have as much time for our conversation as possible. My name's Josh Goode. I'm an associate professor here at Claremont Graduate University of History and Cultural Studies. And I want to welcome you to the fourth event in a semester-long conference commemorating the 25th anniversary of the Cultural Studies Department here at Claremont Graduate University. As a retrospective celebration of a quarter century of our department, we, of course, are thematically engaged by the future. Today's conversation is about the future of the museum, and we are indeed fortunate to have two important figures in this conversation to discuss their sense of the future of the museum. But first, let me make some expressions of gratitude. First, to our colleagues in the School of Arts and Humanities here at CGU who have helped us to fund this conference through the generous support of the Thornton F. Bradshaw Programs and Endowment Fund. Also, thanks go to our students, Kate Rutz Robbins, Lee Painter Kim, and Laura Black, who have been the engines behind the smooth flow of this conference series. And lastly, to my colleagues in the department, the Department of Cultural Studies, who've made this a department defined by intellectual curiosity and engagement that befits, I think, a cultural studies department. And now just some quick housekeeping. We will have Q&A for our discussants after their conversation. The way we're going to work it is we'll have the Q&A box, which you'll see at the bottom of your screen. And so just put your question in there and I will be your interlocutor and ask your question for you. This event is being recorded and there will be a transcription of it after, once we've loaded it up, and we'll make it available. Okay, now to our speakers. And I'm thrilled to welcome them to this conversation. I'm just remain thrilled that they both said yes to come and speak to us. Dr. Tukufu Zuberi is the Lasry Family Professor of Race Relations at the University of Pennsylvania. He received his PhD in sociology from the University of Chicago and has been the author and editor of numerous books. But Dr. Zuberi has also made films, curated exhibits, redesigned museum galleries, and the most recent of which was the redesign of the Africa galleries at the University of Pennsylvania Museum, which you can follow in his documentary series, Decolonizing the Narrative. I think we'll see a little bit of that today. He's also been a history detective on the PBS series of the same name. And more importantly, and I think why I'm so excited that Tukufu has come to speak, he's been probably one of those eloquent, direct, and active spokespeople for decolonizing the museum and their collections over the past few years. As part of a project for constructing a new or future museum. But he's also led by example, by engaging with museum leaders around the world, talking to a wide variety of audiences, constituents, and beneficiaries of a future decolonized museum. But if I went into too much detail about Dr. Zuberi, I would not have time to introduce the person he will be conversing with today. She is Pilar Tompkins Rivas, who is also well known in the museum world for work in reimagining and energetically remaking the museum, especially here in Southern California. From 2016 to 2020, she was the director of the Vincent Price Art Museum, which she transformed into an essential Los Angeles institution, working in particular to expand the presence of Latinx, Chicanx artists in the museal complex of Los Angeles through solo shows and through partnerships with other museums to feature the important works of those artists from their collections. It seems if you name an LA art museum or gallery, Pilar has forged an important connection with it. Last year, she became the Chief Curator and Deputy Director of Curatorial and Collections at the Lucas Museum of Narrative Art, soon to open in Exposition Park in Los Angeles. There, her responsibilities include leadership, strategic direction, managerial oversight for curatorial, exhibitions, acquisitions, collections management, conservation, archives, and publications. Proving, along with Dr. Zuberi, that there must be 30 hours in a day. She is also pursuing a PhD here at CGU in Cultural Studies. Today, they're going to discuss their views of how a new museum, a future museum, is also a decolonized museum. Pilar and Tukufu, I turn it over to both of you. I'm so thrilled, again, that both of you are here.
Thank you, Joshua, for that fantastic introduction. And I am so honored to be in conversation with you, Tukufu. This is, just a real pleasure. And I'm really looking forward to hearing your thoughts and to learning more about your work at the Penn Museum specifically, but also your views on history and sociology and the way that this intersects with the museum field, and what kinds of changes that we need to make, both in the museums that we work in, but also in academia and at large in society, and how we can decolonize institutions that have historically positioned themselves in a way that privileges some cultures over others, and how that can be expanded out into the work of our work within the community and to the public at large. But I know there's so much that you have to share by way of introducing yourself and the important projects that you've worked on. And I know you have also some video to share with our audience. And I want to turn it over to you before we start diving deep.
I want to thank you and express my appreciation for you, Pilar, and the work that you do, and to just express my gratitude for the organizers of the webinar and for all of those people who have taken some time out of their afternoon, their day, their evening. It's evening for me. I understand it's a little bit earlier for you all, but that's fine. So I really appreciate that. I appreciate people taking some time out of their day to listen to these things that we would like to talk about. Perhaps I could by way of introducing myself, I could say a few things about the nature of my project, and then show a small clip on decolonizing the narrative. And the clip is basically a trailer for a larger format piece, which is still a short film that I'm doing a series of short films on museums and dealing with issues of diversity, difference, representation, nationalism, internationalism, and the role of the museum in the past and the future is what I'm trying to deal with. And that's a lot, but I'm trying to deal with it because, for me, I have come to this point where first I start with this, right? Museums are one of the most important spaces where we engage in public conversation, public debate. Not that there are no right and wrong answers, because there are right and wrong answers, but we should have a space in which we engage in a conversation which is leading towards a kind of reconciliation. But the conversation is for the purposes of getting closer to the truth. Hence, in South Africa, they called them the Truth and Reconciliation process, and that was them trying to close the breach which had been created by the white supremacy of apartheid, and having a country which was dedicated to the exclusion and marginalization of the African population in South Africa. So, in some ways, for me, the museum is a key part of that conversation. Of course, that conversation happens in many spaces, and in many forms. I mean, you know, it happens when people put together a constitution, when they put together a census, when they put together other forms of surveillance or maintaining some information about the people who are in the society, and how they help translate that into who we are as a person, who we are as a citizen, who we are as a people. What does it mean to be a person at this moment in the world? And the educational systems and the mass media, fictional films, narrative stories, music, documentaries, news, museums, all these things help us gain what I think is a national narrative, that is a narrative about the nation that we find ourselves in, a kind of international narrative, the relationship of different places in the world to each other and their interdependence on each other, you know. And so that the kind of difficulty that we have entered is that there is a European nationalism that has been practiced in Europe and in all the neo-Europes. Or, you know, if you think of all these places which started out with some settler colonialism, whether it's the US, Brazil, New Zealand, Colombia, Australia, you know, all these places, these kind of settler colonial spaces. And then the kind of European colonial transformation of Asia and Africa, not to mention what impact the legacy of enslavement, Jim Crow, and other forms of marginalization have had on our lives. You know, so this genealogy of coloniality is kind of marred for me. It's totally marked for me. It's totally kind of distorted for me, because in our efforts to even discuss decolonization, we have failed to kind of recognize how people have been racialized in their identity. And what I mean by racialization is where they are considered to have somehow gone through some physical transfiguration in terms of who they are based on their religion and how they look as they arrive at the border as a Syrian in Italy today, how a person who comes from Mexico might look at the border in the United States today, how they might be looked at differently if they go to the border in South Africa or some other part of the world. So in this regard, I try to, in my work, focus on kind of three processes that really are critical for us understanding where we are today, so that we can appreciate how we might go somewhere tomorrow, because that really does, in my mind, require a conversation. And it is a conversation about the creation and articulation of these narratives of identity, whether it is a national narrative or an international narrative, or even our own personal narrative. How do we mediate that with the kinds of information which we are given? And how the museum is a key space in which people develop a sense of who they are and who they can be, because it is a conversation that is happening. The fact that it has been hijacked, the fact that this conversation about who we are has been hijacked by white supremacy is a fundamental problem that we must overcome in order to reconstitute what we can do as human beings. So this kind of public presentation of memorialization, whether it occurs in a museum, whether it occurs in a monument, is really fundamentally important in how we define ourselves as a human, how we define ourselves as a citizen, how we define ourselves as a person. And when people go to history and ethnographic museums, they're trying to find that history. When they go into museums which are focused on some creative dimension of reality, they are trying to get their imagination to think about what can be. And they are inspired by those who engage in this conversation. So video narratives that use archival film, video, or images of a past and images of a future, or an image where a past is made the future, or we are asked to imagine the future in the name of the past. These things become kind of the way we need to think of how we are here and why we are here. So for me, these national narratives are key elements in determining how the world has created itself and how we define what it means to be a human being. and what our rights are, and who should be considered a person that gets counted and a person that gets surveillance. Who should count as a person worthy of their lives being considered valuable, and who does not get this kind of consideration. Now, I know one of the dimensions we want to talk about today is decolonizing this narrative in museums. How can we move museums from being these institutions which are grounded in the white supremacy of the Enlightenment movement and kind of have perpetuated that because of the different forms of marginalization that exist in the society? How do we transform these places as being spaces that lead the conversation about what we can be, about what we can do, and allows us to kind of up the bar in terms of the level of the conversation because we provide information and education. So I did a project which led to the redesign of the Penn Africa Galleries. And I did this by confronting the idea of colonialism and confronting the decolonial process that needs to be taken place in order to liberate this museum, to make it a space for public conversation about Africa, about race, about enslavement, about colonialism, and about how material culture got shifted from Africa to the Americas, to Europe, how people got shifted from Africa to the Americas, to Asia, and to Europe. And so these things have kind of really played a big role in my mind. And so I redesigned the galleries by first turning our attention back on the museum and asking, how do we tell the truth about the museum practice as a way of educating people about the great contributions of Africa to civilization, and reorienting the conversation about difference and how we think and look at each other. Now, I'm gonna play this small clip, which takes about a minute and a half, and then we'll talk. Okay, Pilar? Does that sound good for you?
Yeah, perfect. Mm-hmm.
Okay, let me just take a moment to share my screen. Okay. All right.
From the beginning, Africa was a central part of the conceptualization of the Penn Museum. European colonial domination devastated the African continent. Penn thought about Africa using this colonial mindset. The foundational objects of this collection were created in or taken out of Africa during the periods of enslavement and colonialism.
Nous, on a rencontré l'Europe, il y a eu l'esclavage, il y a eu la colonisation, on est toujours debout. Non seulement nous sommes debout, mais nous avançons maintenant. On va passer au-dessus.
These galleries are designed to expand horizons and to deepen the conversation about African material culture and its representation in Western museums.
So anything done to uplift the culture, the history of the people here is done for the benefit of the world.
We invite you to consider how these objects were made, who made them, and how they came to be in front of you today. The dark history of enslavement and colonialism doesn't stop us from telling stories that celebrate Africa's contribution to humanity. What do you think about this conversation of decolonizing the museum?
It is very important the Western world understand that this is Africa. What belongs to Africa should be returned back to Africa.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And there's so many important topics that you just spoke about and that we also heard on that clip. And I want to start to unpack some of that a little bit, if that's all right. And so, something that stood out to me so strongly in what you just spoke about were kind of three-pronged pillars, if you will, about humanity, citizenship, and personhood, and how that is intertwined with not just what we think of as history, but with processes of historicization. And I think of that in terms of the museum, and you mentioned the Enlightenment, and I think it's important to note that, within the construct of how museums have developed, that it is part and parcel from the principles of Enlightenment, processes of colonization, which inherently bring this ethnographic gaze to non-Western cultures that are embedded within a very complex legacy that work to dehumanize other people in support of the processes of colonization. And then the museum then historically becomes a place to otherize other people that are non-Western or that are not part of that group, and put them on display. So we have this terrible legacy that does lead to not only the dismantling of cultural heritage artifacts and artworks and religious things that pertain to religious practice, moving out of the countries that have been colonized and moving into Western institutions, but even the presentation of human beings within this sort of attempt to categorize the world and across geography and across time. And I see today, like the legacy of that today for me in museums is something that basically begat the academic discipline of art history. And art history in and of itself then is structured around this notion that we have to divide up the world by continent, by groups, by genres, by time periods. And then in our pursuits in academia, we then are pigeonholed into studying certain areas that follow these same principles. And then when you go to find a job in a museum, you're moving into a department that is only hiring for people with expertise in that way. So it's a process that begets itself from colonization, the history of museums, to the way that institutions are structured. Then this of course speaks to structuralized racism that's embedded not only in the institution, but in academia. One of the reasons that I wanted to pursue my PhD, not in art history, but in cultural studies, was that I needed to traverse those strictures myself, because they didn't speak to the humanity of the cultures that I wanted to talk about, because they were left behind and left outside of that, outside of those structures. So I wondered, if you could just speak a little bit about that. I don't know if I'm really asking if it's about the kind of academic discipline that also is intertwined with this, or this kind of legacy of dehumanization and otherization that you find embedded in a museum context.
Yes. See, first I just want to say, so in the United States, as an example, the national narrative of this country has been hijacked by white supremacy. White supremacy is a form of ethnocentrism, which says that all that is good has been white and will be white. And so in that way, it has distorted what it means to be white. It's not like we need to correct it by putting other people on the same page, because white supremacy in itself is a destructive tendency. And when it got totally out of hand, we got World War II, we got the Nazis, we got the whole kind of notion of taking white supremacy and articulating it as a modern form of human aspiration. And that was catastrophic. So white supremacy as an idea is damaging. Another component of it is that coloniality is something that we need to temporarize. We need to put it in a historical context, right? Because that's the only way we can get to why we decolonizing the museum, is to understand what this colonial mentality was. The Enlightenment movement provided information to facilitate and justify the colonialism between 1880 and the end of World War II. Mm-hmm. And so this particular justification of colonialism as being a way to help out people who were marked as inferior because of their geopolitical relationship to other countries in the world. their relationship with the United States meant that their history was not going to be studied. I mean, even Hegel and Kant doubted that Africa had history. And you still have today people who think that the only thing they need to do is read Hegel and Kant, when Hegel and Kant had already dismissed themselves by saying they did not read about Africa. And if they didn't read about Africa, they didn't read about Asia. And if they didn't read about Asia, they didn't read about the indigenous populations. And so they gave you a distortion of what European knowledge was about by ignoring the world that Europe was interacting with. Europe did not invent writing. Europe did not invent ink. Europe did not invent the boats that they used to visit America or to visit Asia. They did not invent the gunpowder that went in the gun. So there is an intercommunication that existed that led to this particular trajectory of how we are where we are today. Now, these objects, it is important to know they were stolen. It is important to know that there was theft that facilitated the international movement of these objects out of Africa, out of Asia, and out of certain parts of Europe to situate them in the British Museum or the Louvre or any place like this. And we need to understand that, because that's the real way we begin to understand how this material culture got here and what it means. So when you look at something like Africa, those materials that came from Africa, for the most part, the material culture, the classical material culture from Africa is taken out of Africa during either enslavement or colonialism. All the objects were made during enslavement or colonialism. And so they are marred by this mark of being part of the colonial and enslaving trade. And so to really have a conversation about them is to discuss enslavement. It is to discuss colonialism. It is to discuss the dependence of Europe on this enslavement in order to generate the societies we live in now. And see, if you ignore that, then it's easy to ignore those artists who were Black, brown, and other colors in the United States doing wonderful art, but being ignored because of the white supremacy of the art market, the white supremacy in art history. So it's not just there was art history was biased, art history was about white supremacy. So those who were studying African history were about showing white supremacy in the study of African history. Those who collected the objects we find in the museums, they collected those objects as a way of articulating white supremacy. That's why at the Penn Museum, we turned the gaze around and we said, we're going to look at you. How did this get here? Why are you showing us this? What are you trying to teach us? And then begin to use that as a way of having a conversation about why these objects are here and why we need to create a culture of cultural circulation, information about cultural circulation, about our past, our present, and our future. Kids inside of Africa have a right to see the historical treasures that are here in the United States. Here in the United States, we have historical treasures from China. We have historical treasures from Ghana, historical treasures from all the countries in Africa. And they've been here and we've been benefiting from their presence here. Now we need to make this more of a circulation. We need to talk about developing the conversation at the international level so it does that. We're beginning to do that nationally. We're beginning to do that with the creation of the Sabo Museum, with the creation of the Northwestern Museum of African American History and Culture, with the National Museum of African American History and Culture, with the Philadelphia Museum of African American Culture. We're beginning that conversation, but it is far from where we need to go in order to generate a kind of circulation of information which can serve as a place for public debate and conversation, serve as a place for inclusion rather than exclusion. Because you can exclude people in different ways. I mean, during segregation, it meant you didn't let those people come in. And so you can exclude them by not letting them come in. But another way of excluding them is making them invisible. so that even when they come in, they do not find themselves. They come in the museum and they see a white gaze that presents anything about them. And it is a white gaze that's not trying to be in conversation, it's trying to be exclusive.
Yeah.
So where do we go from here is trying to be inclusive, recognizing this space as a place for public discourse, conversation. And how do we move that towards being more inclusive and providing people with more information about difference so that we can deal with the future that we have, which is not going to be a white future. It is not white people against other people. It's all of us against an idea whose time has died, and that's white supremacy. What we need is human supremacy. And the way we do that is by fighting against the retelling of a Eurocentric narrative about what it means to be a human being. What is our relationship to the dinosaurs? What is this notion of colonialism that it is so deeply ingrained in our minds that we talk about colonizing space? We don't even recognize the folly of our ways because we haven't provided a critique of what colonization meant in the past and what we need to do to think about how we build a future in which we are in more harmony with the spaces we're in and with each other.
Yeah. Well, I agree 100%. I mean, I think you're talking about so many things that resonate with me very, very deeply. And, you know, I'm just going to pick up on a few things that I heard you say. And I was thinking about historicity and truth, and that oftentimes we look to the context of a museum to tell us our history. And that is something that can be very occluded if your history is not represented. And there's a falseness in that narrative, because as you say, I mean, it's a narrative of white supremacy. So it is to the detriment and exclusion of the multiplicity of stories and to the truth around around the way that objects came to be in view right in front of you. That it's almost like you're thinking about these objects as entities in and of themselves and devoid from the context and the history that they carry inherently with them. And I think it's not just objects, but it's even if you were to look at any painting or illustration on the wall, you would also have to think about it more broadly and put it into context to understand how and why it is that you're coming to see that image in front of you.
That's right. I mean, I was in Argentina a couple of years ago, and I picked up a book on mask, and it was a very old book. You know, in Argentina, they have these shops where they're selling antiques, and you can go in there and have a wonderful time negotiating with people and things like that. And I saw this book, and it was a book in French on masks. And it reminded me of this film made in France about no more masks, about Africa, you know, in African museums. Mm-hmm. And this book was full of essays by the Surrealist artists. Mm-hmm. And they were being inspired by looking at these masks. And they had this primitive idea about Africa. They had this exotic idea about Africa. They had this condescending idea about Africa being primitive. And as a result of its primitiveness, offering them something which was more clear than they were finding in the muddle of European and modern civilization. And so Africa was the primitive for them. And this exotic making of Africa as the primitive, for some artists who people might think the Surrealists were advanced in terms of their politics of ideas of human beings and inclusion and economics and all this. But here in this moment, what you see is their racism. And though there were many, I mean, Wilfredo Lam, Amy Cesar, Susanna Cesar, there were many, many Pan-Africanists and many Black people who were part of the Surrealist movement, yet it had this tinge to it when they kind of start talking about what they meant about Africa. And this kind of exotic making of Africa is a very important point, right? Because now, if you keep the Africans out of the museum, then you can do that. If you keep the people who identify with the Africans out of the museums, then you can do that. But as those people enter the museum, it becomes obvious that this is wrong. And as you begin to look at those objects and you say, why isn't this object connected to these people? Why isn't this place, why isn't this culture connected to people? And it is connected to people. It's connected to people who came here as a consequence of enslavement. It is connected to people who had their art removed from their space and brought here. It is connected to the people who live on reservations where their bones have been taken from Syria's resting places and put here. It displaces those people who think they're looking at modern art and all they get is modern European art. All they get is modern white American art. And that when they see the art of other people, when they see the art of Black people, when they see the art of brown people, it almost becomes a fetishized thing about wow. When the real wow is you spend all of this time concentrating on a specific place of our creativity. Do you know how blind you have been in terms of human potential, in terms of where we can go? And kind of making the conversations rest on those who would say the world is better off for white supremacy is the cry of those who are saying, listen to us. We have been human beings and we will be human beings. And we offer you respect as a human being, but you must give it back. Which is why people have said no more, right? That's why people are in the streets marching against the police brutality against Black folks, not because it just started, but because now it's on social media. Now it is not controlled by a media who was insensitive to this community. So the same thing has to take place in museums. They must reconnect their material culture to the communities they represent, and they must make the communities that are represented in those spaces more inclusive. It's like people who talk about the future and don't have a connection to Afrofuturism or understand how Afrofuturism has to be in a response to debunking the mythologies that museums have created. So we almost need that kind of conversation in order to undo the Eurocentrism, which has perverted our ability to understand what it is even to gaze at good art, because our gaze have been whitened. And just like it don't matter if the policeman is Black or white, it matters what they do. It doesn't matter what we are, it matters what we do. Now, if you don't give diversity in these spaces, that's a problem too. But even when you give the diversity, it has to be with the anticipation that you're going to diversify the ideas. You're going to diversify the mission. You're going to diversify how people interact with this space. And you're going to have to be a space where there is a public conversation about these issues.
Yeah. I know, you know, in the wake of George Floyd last summer, I mean, museums were having conversations and scrambling. I was a museum director at the time and privy to national conversations of people just being with the pandemic and with everything happening, the social reckoning and people just beginning to barely ask themselves these questions, just barely, it seemed to me. And it was like, my God, when are you going to wake up and smell the coffee and join the conversation? And so museums are very slow in that way to change and slow to act. It's very hard, you know, to give up power in that way. People that are in power don't want to give up power.
Absolutely.
To make change.
Absolutely. And see, what you have described is a perfect example of structural racism. Often people want to know, what are people talking about structural racism? If you are in a situation and it looks too white to you, it's because of structural racism. If most of the curators are not a diverse group of people, if most of the museum directors are not a diverse group of people, if most of the keepers are not a group of diverse people. You have an institution which is grounded in racism, in its structure of reproducing itself, and in its structure of articulating its mission and how it has achieved that mission. The way you undo that is by undoing those particular structural aspects which foster that as a legitimate practice. It should not be a legitimate practice where people say, we are going to be a space that ignores this call for social justice, that ignores this call for racial justice, that ignores this demand that we represent the communities that we exist in. And that's because of the centrality of these institutions in the public discourse. And because they're important in that public discourse, they cannot afford to ignore the conversations of the people or the people's interests. And their interest is in finding places where they can have legitimate, honest conversations about things they don't know about, so that education is being provided, but it also provides a space for them to talk back, for their community to talk back. And so I think I'm part of that talking back. I'm talking back to those who would once say that look, I'm a professor, documentary filmmaker, museum curator, and there's something else in there, television host. I've done that too for a while. And in doing all of these things, one thing that I have tried to emphasize is that the structural racism, which created the vacuum so that we don't ourselves automatically, instinctively demand a renegotiation of what we talk about and how we talk about that. That's insulting to us as human beings, especially at this time and moment. And so I want to engage in those conversations. So when there was a group at the Independent Seaport Museum, which they came to me and they said, we'd like you to do an exhibit. And right now, this is back in 2013, we're preparing for the Year of Freedom. You know, Philadelphia, freedom, there's this conversation. Philadelphia likes to think of itself as one of the pioneers of the idea of freedom and one of the pillars in terms of the creation of modern notions and modern practices of freedom. And so I did an exhibit called The Tides of Freedom, the African Presence on the Delaware, which was a critique of the idea of freedom in the United States because of those who were denied that freedom, who were denied that freedom because of enslavement, who were denied that freedom because of Jim Crow, who were denied that freedom because fights against the civil rights of people continue to this day as they attack the voting rights. So that all of that has a link to how we prepare people to engage intelligently in discussions about difference, in discussions about who we are, in discussions about the world that we want to create. So in doing that gallery, again, I turned the view back onto the gallery and turned the gaze back on freedom itself. Rather than taking it as a given, I talked about it as an ill-conceived concept that we have yet to articulate in a way that facilitates our embracing of difference and does not continue, right? The legacies of structural forms of racism. Enslavement was a structural form of racism. Jim Crow, a structural form of racism. Mass incarceration, a structural form of racism. The justice system in the United States is a structural form of racism. Those things are in need of transformation. The only way we're going to make those changes is by having a conversation and by coming to some resolutions and reconstituting our relationships with each other, a reconciliation. But a reconciliation has to be based on a truth. You know, and if you look at monuments like Robert E. Lee monuments, these monuments were put up to be an insult to African Americans, to be a justification of white supremacy. So it is not a neutral statue that was placed. Most of them were put up in the 1920s, but they were put up to say we are a white nation and we will remain a white nation. So defending these statues which were put up to insult a part of your community is something you ought to take a second look at. And when people do that, they immediately want to remove those statues. If you go into an art museum today and it is full of art, and none of that art is reflective of the diversity of the place that you are looking at, you need to question it, because it should be considered more so a special exhibit that is narrowly focused on a small group of people who have been highlighted by another small group of people.
That's a great point. That's a very valid point. I mean, that's always, since I work in Latinx art and live in Southern California, and 50% of the population is Latinx and has historically been excluded from all museums up until relatively recently, that was always the big question that I asked myself. How are institutions relevant if they don't have any reflection of the people that are here within this region who have built this place, whose family—
I'll tell you how they're relevant. They are relevant because they help sustain the myths of white supremacy. And they have been so relevant, so that even when Latinx people were going into those museums, they were being relevant because of the invisibility of the community, the invisibility of the narrative of the people's history. You know, I grew up in California, okay? And it could have easily been Mexico. But to not tell its history that is Mexican, to not tell its history that is indigenous, is a violation of the truth.
Yeah.
And so white supremacy is that violation.
You said some interesting things that I wanted to just make sure I didn't lose track of. And one of them, I think, was, you know, you may have said the word neutrality or talked about neutrality. I mean, I just wanted to point out that institutions for me are not neutral places. They're coded spaces that we have to learn how to navigate, especially as people of color. That idea of having a conversation about what they are, what they contain, who they serve, and what they ought to be doing is a complex one. But I think a lot of people, at least as I was developing in my career, would tell me, oh, it's a neutral space. And you're the outsider having the conversation that wants to come in and infiltrate this neutral conversation. You're otherized, and you're trying to kind of enforce your opinion in this context, rather than looking at it very looking at whiteness as a construct that you can also evaluate and understand and discuss. And
it's the unwarranted right entitlement of whiteness. That's all that is. It's unwarranted entitlement of whiteness. And people need to suck it up. They don't know nothing. If you don't know the indigenous history, quit acting like you're talking about it.
Yeah.
If you don't know the Latinx history, then quit acting like you're talking about it. If you don't know the African-American history, then quit acting like you're talking about it. If you don't know the Asian American history, then quit acting like you're talking about it. Because once you're acting like you're talking about it, what's on your walls will necessarily be different. And if what's on your walls aren't necessarily different, if your monuments aren't necessarily different, then you haven't changed the conversation. And if you don't see a need for the change of the conversation, then just keep your red hat on, because you are burning with ignorance. And that is not good for anybody. And look, okay, I'm a professor, so I'm obviously not against ignorance, okay? I'm not opposed to ignorance. What I am opposed to is ignorance that is arrogant, because as a professor, I am a person who aims to end ignorance. But when people are arrogant about their ignorance, then they no longer want to understand. They don't want to know. They'll tell you things like, I don't know none, and I don't want to know none. I ain't going up in there because those people talking like this. Did you see how they messed it up? Because they add all those other people in there. And yes, it needs to be messed up. The narrative needs to be dislodged. The entitlement of whiteness needs to leave our imagination. And I'm talking about ours as human beings, not just me, but white people too. Everybody needs to lose this sense of ethnocentrism in order to have an articulation about what it means to be human that recognizes we must empathize with each other, but not do that based on a lie. I can't empathize with you over whether I am a human being or not. I cannot empathize with you over whether you should tell my story or not. We can discuss my story and how it gets told. We can discuss the future, which you don't own. We own the future. We will shape the future. And so recognizing that means that you must listen to those people who are doing it. We're in danger of losing it all. We're in danger of destroying the environment. We're in danger of not even seeing the need to correct our ways about the climate and the environment because we don't respect each other. We can barely hold conversation across ethnic lines, across national lines, across kind of racial lines. All these divides have created a place in which we must demand a conversation for more inclusiveness. That's why the people are in the streets. That's why they're pulling down monuments. That's why they're protesting at museums to correct the politics that are in their narratives. I agree with you 100%. It is contested, but it's not just contested for anything. It's not just us against them. It's the truth against the lies and deceptions that have been sold in these institutions since their creation.
I think you just said something so important, and you've said other things that tied exactly to that point, and it's evidenced in your work across your multidisciplinary practice, and that is not being afraid to look at difficult truths, difficult histories rather, not being afraid to contend and discuss difficult history so that we can really understand the past, think about what it means for us in the present, and imagine the future, and somewhere along the way, redefine how we understand truth. And one of the ways that I've seen you do that in my observation of your work is to also take a very specific approach about transnationalism and hemispheric and global perspectives, thinking about Africa and its importance globally, its impact internationally, hemispherically in the Americas, in Asia, and how it has, and tracing its history and legacy to understand the context that we live in today and to think about futurity. And I just wanted to see if you could speak a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, so if we're going to have a future, we are going to have that future. We will not survive with a new wave of white supremacy on planet Earth. It will do nothing but divide us further at a moment that we need to come together. Our environment is at a tipping point. Our consideration of difference is at a tipping point. Racism is on the rise all over Europe. Racism is on the rise all over Asia. The anti-Muslim sentiments in China and in Myanmar are not accidents. The anti-Islamic attitude in some spaces in the United States is not new, but it is just as decisively destructive for us coming together as human beings. As you said, if you are going, okay, this is 21st century. If you are going in a museum in California and it does not kind of give you a sense of the level of diversity of California, of its Asian community, of its Latinx community, of its African-American community, of its African community, of its varied communities, then you're in the wrong space. Because they're not giving you a representation of the culture no matter what you want to do in that space. Even if it's buying a piece of art from learning about the history of California. Both of those spaces require a renegotiation of what it means for us to be a people. There was a playwright named Terence of Rome in 160 something BC. And he said this, and I got his quote from listening to Maya Angelou, but his quote goes something like this: I am human, therefore nothing humans do is alien to me. And I thought, now that's a challenge for me,
Mhm.
because that calls for me to respect the possibility that the stone cold racist, right, is not doing something that I couldn't do. I don't, because I've made choices in my life. That the bigot, that the murderer, that the tyrant, that all of them are similar to me. Therefore, there is a moment which I must recognize their intellectual capacity to communicate with me. Not that I have to agree with their bigotry, but if I'm going to teach them, I need to be able to empathize with their way of thinking if I am going to change it.
Mhm.
If we do not change the way we think about each other, tomorrow is not guaranteed. We're talking about closing borders at a moment we need to be talking about opening borders. We're talking about restricting the circulation of human beings at a moment when we need to talk about increasing that. Of course, we have to do it differently because of the pandemic and social distancing and wearing our mask and all. But yet we must find a way to intercommunicate with each other, because we live in an intercommunicating world. The world we live in now is very different than the world when people imagined perfecting white supremacy. It did not work. White supremacy did not work. White supremacy is not helping advance humanity. It is turning the clock back. And whenever you stand up and say that your program is to go back in time rather than forward in time, it is a certain reaction of your fear about the future. And so your fear about the future turns on those who bring the future, hence the diversity, hence the Latinx community in America, hence the kind of diverse communities entering Europe from all kind of corners as their wars implode on themselves. So that there is a need for us to decolonize our way of thinking about who we are, therefore decolonizing the way we think about our future. There is a need for us to deracialize the way we think about what it means to be a human being. We must dislodge this notion that certain people have certain characteristics which are worthy of them not being treated as first-class citizens, that some people are not going to be counted as first-class citizens because of where they came from, because of how they came from there, because of what they represent in terms of how this narrative has been told in the past. We're past that. Get over it. We're not going to take it again. No Latinx community in the United States is going to sit around and say, we're going to be quiet. We're not going to represent. No Asian American community going to sit around and say, we're going to be silent and invisible. Those days are over. Ignoring the indigenous population in the United States, in Brazil, in Colombia, in Peru, in Ecuador, ignoring them and how they are represented in these spaces is no longer tolerable. And this mythology of the Louvre, this mythology of the British Museum, this mythology of the Penn Museum as being universal spaces of knowledge and representation of all human civilization is a distortion and an insult to human beings. Because if we were creating cathedrals like that, these museums, we should have one on every single continent. We should have one in every single nation. And they should have access to the material culture of all these other places. That's creating a humanity for the future. That's creating a culture that is truly circulating rather than exploiting other people, stealing their stuff, building up our collections, telling narratives about those thefts which never mention the word theft, never mention the connection to colonialism, never mention the connection to enslavement. So I'm trying to undo that. So when you go and you see my exhibits, that's what I do. And I try to challenge this articulation of what race means, because just because that's what it meant doesn't mean we need to carry it forward. Just because it was a socially constructed concept to create and maintain a hierarchy of race in the past does not mean that that's the idea we need to have for the future. The idea that we have for the future needs to be more intersectional. It needs to be more holistic. It needs to be a recognition of different peoples who have had different experiences, but that have all come together to create what we call the now, and how that can accelerate into a future of abundance rather than the one we see now, which is everything is drying up. A very negative, pessimistic interpretation of that future. But that's why Afrofuturism is so important.
Yeah.
Because Afrofuturism is challenging the future in which Black people are not there, uninvisibilizing them, right? Remember The Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison, wonderful piece of work, where he questions the existence of the Black body because of the conceptualization of what it means. So what it means to be a human being, it does not include those bodies in that conversation. And as a result of not including those bodies in that conversation, it distorts what those bodies are. It's like going to Peru and not recognizing that there are Black people in Peru, or going to Ecuador and not recognizing the legacy and the history of the Black community against racism in Ecuador, against racism in Colombia, against racism in Brazil, against racism in Mexico. I mean, Mexico just started asking the race question on its census in this last census. So the very fact that people have had enough is having an impact on how the world is viewing itself. Yeah. We need to grow with this conversation.
Yeah. We need to lean into that conversation, yes, and go very deep into that conversation. I mean, I feel like we are undoing centuries of another process in order to re-articulate, contend with it, re-articulate it, and think about how we can restructure and change in the future and participate in a shared process of liberation and rehumanization rather than dehumanization of the way that we've been divided across humanity, across time.
And that's what education is about. That's what the museum should be about. The museum should be fostering this conversation. How do we create our common future? How does that add to our creativity, to our ability to imagine tomorrow? That is a tomorrow which is not frozen by today or yesterday, but is recognizing those as those shadows which kind of cover up some of our sun as we run for the new, because the new is coming. Everything is not just a repetition of the same old thing, but to imagine that future means that we must grab, right, this opportunity to pursue what it means to be a human being in a different articulation. I am so proud when I go to these Black Lives Matter marches, there are as many white kids as everybody else. They understand, if they understand Black Lives Matter, if they understand why it is important to have Latinx material in the museum, why it is important for the museum to release itself from the negative interpretations of what it means to be a human being that have been articulated by art history, that have been articulated by anthropology and articulated by sociology. If we do not undo that, then we will continue to teach intolerance, even though sometimes we call that being tolerant.
Yeah. I have one more area that I feel is directly related to this as well. And I want to make sure we have time for a few questions from the audience, but this is kind of a big topic. And I think in keeping with that idea, could we talk a little bit about restitution and repatriation of objects and also of human remains in the context of institutions in the US, UPenn, in Los Angeles, in other Western museums? I wonder if you could speak a little bit about that.
So the premise of museums, was created as a material form of representing the universality of European colonial powers. That was the connection of enlightenment to these museums. Part of that meant having a colonial narrative of China, a colonial narrative of Mexico, a colonial narrative of Cuba, of Puerto Rico, right? A colonial narrative of Haiti, a colonial narrative of Africa, a colonial narrative of the Middle East, a colonial narrative of India. It required having a colonial narrative, because what does that colonial narrative do? It gives justification for white supremacy. It gives legitimacy in the idea that you don't need to know nothing about the history of Africa, about the history of China, about the history of Mexico, and hence about the history of African Americans, about the history of Asian Americans, about the history of the indigenous populations to this place, right? Mm-hmm. People go around thinking that they can just be arrogant about that. They don't know nothing and they don't want to know nothing, but that, you know, they got some relative who was an Indian. But besides that, they can't tell you nothing about the indigenous population that was there. Yes, the Lenape. That's who was here. That's what land I'm standing on. I want to pay them some tribute for that very process, because of the colonial process that unnamed them here in Philadelphia. As we begin to think about these processes, to get beyond this, we must decolonize these spaces. One of the first things which we're getting there is decolonize the mind, undo the labeling, undo the branding, undo the way we talk about it. So if we have an Africa collection and they have Benin objects in there, we have to say these are objects which have been stolen from the Benin Empire and spread around the world. What we are seeing is the majesty of a society which was devastated by European colonialism. What are we going to do about that? This is part of the exhibit. You can't hide the stuff in the archive. You need to bring it out and begin to talk to the people whose property it is. And the little clip there, as the man said, this stuff is African and it should come back to Africa. Come back to Africa is a question we need to understand. How do you do that? And how do you do that when some of it is related to the communities which came here also from Africa? Mm-hmm. And how you gonna have a conversation about African objects in the diaspora without talking about the African diaspora? Doesn't make sense to me. I mean, definitely you can ignore it because not many African Americans have specialized in African material culture. And therefore they don't understand even the significance of the stakes of looking at Africa in a more complex way. Because I want my children to be able to have some connection to Benin, to be able to have a connection in which Benin is not totally disconnected from them. Just because people have done it with the objects doesn't mean they need to do it with the people. Now, for me, that question is important, but it doesn't undo the issue of restitution. Of course, the Benin objects should be returned to the Benin Kingdom. But the Benin Kingdom needs to recognize the reciprocity that is necessary in recognizing the communities that are here that have an organic relationship to that material culture. But this would require a revamping of what it means to be in these museums.
Yeah.
And the similar conversations go into those museums which profess to be showing us modern and contemporary art without a consideration of the social processes that put that art in the places that it's at. And how those curators who come and challenge that, right? Like you said, you're all over California challenging the invisible, the untalking of the Latinx community in these spaces. That's what they have done. It's not like that, you know, all of a sudden people say, hey, I can paint and I'm Mexican. Or I can paint and I'm Californian, but I ain't trying to be connected to Europe. I got these connections to this indigenous population. I got these connections into this mestizo population. I got all these kind of connections that I'm trying to articulate requires a revamping of how we think about material culture. When you have these representations of the physical body in these spaces, it is a further extreme example of their insult of our collective humanity. Can you imagine? They had 50 enslaved individuals in the Morton collection at the Penn Museum. 50. Some of them were enslaved individuals from Cuba, but some of them were enslaved individuals from the land that the University of Pennsylvania Museum is on. Wow. And not to consider that. And to show those things as if they represented what the racists who collected them meant. He went grave robbing. He went taking people's bodies without their consent, without their family's consent, without their community's consent. So this is a step in the right direction, is to decolonize, to de-racialize the collection of the Penn Museum. And so these are two examples in which the Penn Museum is moving in the correct way. Of course, it has to undo the Morton collection.
Yeah.
He did the collection as a racist act to defend white supremacy. That's the collection of skulls that they have at the University of Pennsylvania. They have about 1,300 skulls. But he included in that, because he was arguing for white supremacy, he was arguing that white supremacy was real, and this is back in the 1830s. Or the first part of the 19th century. And he's making this argument and he's using these skulls to do it. And so now here we are in 2021 and we know he stole those people's skulls. What else are we going to do? And this is an educational institution. It is grounded on telling the truth. So we have to start with the truth. And so we must confront that truth as an obvious, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so part of that is actually returning objects, but also part of that is increasing the technology and the spaces in which those objects are shown. And also part of that is establishing collaborations in which we share material culture with those places as well to increase their understanding about American society.
Yeah.
It doesn't go one way. Just because it has been going that way doesn't mean we need to continue to think that way. We must think out of this box. How do we change this world? Well, we change this world by thinking of cultural circulation and communication as just that and not as cultural domination.
I know we have questions from the audience and I want to just maybe pick up on a few words from what you've just said and like maybe hold them in our minds as we kind of move towards the questions. You know, I was thinking about what you said in terms of the intersectional approach, the way of thinking about culture. And this is how I would say, I'm not saying what you said, but in my own words is looking at it, you know, the roots and routes of culture and thinking about it as a matrix, you know, that we're looking at all of it in a holistic way, you know, a holistic approach to humanity in order to think about our future.
And once you get to the intersectionality of it, you're thinking like, okay, so we know from that we're going to be talking about men and women and others. We know for that we're going to be talking about Asian Americans, the Latinx community. We're going to be talking about African Americans. We're going to be talking about Asians. We're going to be talking about Muslims. We're going to be talking about Jews. We're going to be talking about Protestants. You automatically begin to think about all the beautiful creative ways to talk about the intersecting ways in which people have better made our world. Yeah. And even about some of those who have tried to derail the project, who've tried to derail the project of the human experiment, not the American experiment, the human experiment. Are we going to be good for the planet? Are we going to help each other? Are we going to find a way to make our empathy result in us creating a space in which we are mutually benefiting our existence on the planet?
I think
How
that
do we do that?
that's a very powerful statement to maybe, pause on and pivot, if we may. And I'll ask Professor Goode to come back in. And I believe there are a few questions from the audience.
Yeah, there are. Thanks, Pilar, and thank you so much, Tukufu. So there are a couple questions. I had a couple questions lined up too, but I'm gonna squelch them for the questions that have come in. But I might try to coalesce the questions that have come in right now, at least along one particular theme, because they are actually quite practice oriented. People are, we have a number of people here who are museum practitioners working on setting up a collection or a display, or wondering about how to bring in diverse artists and diverse audiences, and then how to deal with recalcitrant museums. So one way of getting at a couple of these questions is, let me ask you a particular question to Tukufu and also to Pilar. In our conversations about here, I'm going to ask the question I want to ask anyway. In our conversations about decolonizing in so many different places and in so many different museums, the focus is defensively, I think, on collections as a way, in a sense, of occluding or hiding the argument that really you're making, Tukufu, about really it's about destabilizing the institution itself, our systems of knowledge, our values that undergird that museum. And so can you describe just one particular example of an object that you put on display that allowed you to decolonize the exhibition, decolonize the Penn Museum, or something you've seen elsewhere? And Pilar, same question to you. In other words, an emblematic example of how you've done the work that you do.
And in this documentary I made about how we try to decolonize the narrative in the Africa galleries at the Penn Museum, we use one example, which is an ivory bracelet. And this ivory bracelet comes from Benin, and it was worn by an Oba. And we can tell all that from looking at the iconography of it, looking at the material that it was made from, and it was stolen out of the palace. Okay, now we know all of that. And one way that we can know that is we went into the archive of the museum and we look at when it was bought, and we have the letter written from the person who was in Nigeria at that point, in Benin at that point, at the site at that point, and he's writing a letter to his brother to ask his brother to try to sell some material that he has to the Penn Museum. Now, that's clear, right? Everything about that is clear. And so part of the narrative of the exhibit is to show how that process happened, to make it publicly available, and to put the information for the conversation about where these objects should be up and front. Because in some ways, people are saying, no, I'm not going to show it, but they still got it in their archive. Other people are saying, I'm going to give it back, but they never showed the story about how they got it. They never made that part of their institutional narrative of what they have. And they kind of want to move it so that they can get back to the old narrative. And what I'm saying, getting back to the old narrative is as problematic as having that object in their collection, because it is the ultimate deception. And just giving the object back doesn't change the nature of the museum, because what are they doing to compensate those children who lost the opportunity for interacting with this material culture? This is the big price you pay, right? So you had your kind of white supremacy, which ignored the humanity of the people. Once you recognize their humanity, now you must live that. And to live that burden, you have to consider what was lost, who benefited by you having that material culture, and who lost something by you having that material culture, who benefited by you making them invisible, right? And what did it do to them that you made them invisible? What does it do to people that they made the connection between these Benin material pieces of Benin culture, made them, the connection of those material culture disconnected from the people in Benin, disconnected from the Black diasporas in the United States. What have they done when they did that? That's generations of deception and trauma that they have become a part of. How do you correct that? You'd have to engage in conversations of repair. You would have to engage in a kind of systematic education of the staff, right? Of how they would do that. We had one meeting, because we had several meetings with the general staff at the Penn Museum, and it's a pretty big museum. And in one of those meetings, a young man said, Tukufu, how am I going to explain this to people? You're asking me to explain to them that the museum stole stuff. It's the same thing they said in the Black Panther, and people already mad at us for, the stuff that's so, and now you got it straight up in there. It's stolen. Here's the proof and the evidence. And we created a conversation, right? With the National Commission of Museums in Nigeria, with the people at the Benin Museum, with the royal family of Benin, with the National Museums of Lagos, to have a conversation with them about how do we go to the next level of this conversation and just move to some action that we can engage in so we can serve as a model with all of these different kinds of solutions being articulated for this material culture at this moment. What do we do as an institution with a very large collection that generates that conversation? So we did it boldly. We put the stuff there, we talked about its theft, we showed its beauty, and we engaged in this conversation. So you cannot undo that. As a curator, I love it. We started a conversation about the necessity to undo the narrative intellectually about colonialism, and then created an action in which we are talking to those museums in Africa about establishing a different relationship. Just like we have a different relationship now with indigenous communities, and in terms of the remains from those indigenous communities, we're beginning to redress that as a way of shifting the axis on which this institution is based. We must change it. You can't simply act like these people don't exist. You must include them in your conversation about the future. You must include them in the discussion about the significance of the material culture in the space, whether it's past, present, or future gazing. But we can't have a gaze which is simply the same old white notion that somehow the white stuff is given, and then everybody else you got to give them something now. We cannot assume the entitlement of whiteness. We must assume the entitlement of humanness. And to do that, we must bring Africa back in the conversation. We must bring the indigenous population back in the conversation. And these distortions and lies, which have been manifest by erasing the narratives of other people, have to be undone. And that's the decolonization. That's the deracialization. It is by embracing the diversity, embracing the difference, and rearticulating narratives which make people feel whole. If the museum is going to be this prime educational space, it must take the challenge of changing itself. And so my response to the young man is that, yes, you are the person I did this for. I want you to challenge yourself in how you present the material culture in this museum. And I hope you are so challenged by the Africa galleries that you do it in all the other galleries at this museum. And I hope you are so motivated by it that when you enter a museum space, a curated space, that you instantly begin to ask the questions about how they're dealing with this question of what it means to be a human being, and what are our relationships to each other as we interdependently make our future.
So amazing. And I just have one example that I can talk about briefly that it stands out to me and maybe is a little different than what Tukufu was talking about, in that I work a lot with contemporary artists and was invited to do a project at the Huntington in Pasadena. And the Huntington is, a museum founded by Henry Huntington, and, early 20th century, tycoon, if you will, and it's founded on English, precedent for kind of English and American art and culture. And I invited 2 artists to do projects there through a partnership with the Huntington and the Vincent Price Museum where I worked. And I invited Mario Ibarra Jr., and who's from Long Beach, Wilmington, California. He would want me to specify, and Carolina Caicedo, who is a Colombian artist, born in London, lived in Puerto Rico, then has been in the US and in Los Angeles for a number of years. And I wanted to talk specifically about video that Carolina did. Both the artists were invited to look into the collections, the art collections, the library collections, and the gardens, and produce new work based on their response to those collections. Yeah. And after our first meeting with all the staff, all the curators, and I have a lot of friends at the Huntington, so I hope they don't mind me saying this, but when I met with the artists right after, they were like, oh my God, we have to flip the script. We have to decolonize the hell out of this place. It's really what they said to me that the artists wanted to do. And Carolina's video, really stood out because she did a performance with dancers who were Latinx, non-binary, African-American, Afro-Latinx. And she worked with a Brazilian choreographer, and they moved through the gardens of the Huntington and in the rarefied spaces of rare book rooms, libraries that you have to have a very particular PhD pedigree in order to enter, even to enter, to be a reader in those spaces, as well as the museum galleries where you can see, the Blue Boy and all those types of works and sculptures that really reinscribe that narrative that was established through the way that the museum was established and its collections and its holdings. But they go through all of these spaces and move with the movements of the orishas. They move with the idea of their bodies being water and being connected to nature and channeling Afro deities that are prevalent in Afro-Latinx religions, from Candomblé to Santeria and specifically the Yoruban tradition from West Africa, and that kind of movement that that their bodies did, and their costumes are somewhat in the Afro-Brazilian colonial dress. To see them, their bodies articulated in that space of whiteness was incredibly powerful. And the piece is called Apparitions, or Apariciones in Spanish, and they do appear to be ghostly in many of the images. They move through this place, but the artist's intention was that they speak to the bodies that actually built that site, the indigenous bodies, the Black bodies, the brown bodies that are from that place and that built that place, that you do not see when you enter that place. And it was it's an amazing video. We ended up co-acquiring it with the Huntington, and I believe, if I'm not mistaken, they'll have to correct me, it was the first piece of video art that they ever collected. But nonetheless, it was one that, in terms of the museum director and myself, we both really connected to that piece, and people at the Huntington didn't want it to go away. So that was something that I felt like had an impact at that organization. And it's a beautiful piece, and something that I really felt, was a successful way of taking an invitation, being invited in to come into a space that doesn't really invite a lot of people of color to participate historically, and to see how we can intervene in the collections and change the narrative. Even if you're shifting it just a little bit, it felt pretty important.
Can I say something? I really resonate with this, Pilar. So what we did is, in the Africa galleries, we got 5 artists to make modern, it was proposed as a conversation. I said, here, I got this idea, I'm trying to put this together. Can you respond to that? you know, and they responded wonderfully in these major pieces, which are in the gallery, so that now there's a conversation across the diaspora, across Africa, with and across time in these galleries with, you know, artists. One artist from Brazil, he did a facade of one of the main walls before you enter the gallery. And in this facade are carved the orishas of Candomblé. And it has two windows, and in those two windows, one of them, it has an eshu, an eshu, which is one of the orishas of Candomblé, and it is there. In another window is an Nkisi statue. Both of them are for the same thing in terms of protection at the crossroads and the doors, but both of them coming from two different spaces, which are synergistically connected because of the African diaspora who has a connection to this artwork, right? And so what you're talking about is beautiful. I can't wait to see this video. You got to hook me up. I need to see
I will.
that. This is powerful.
Well, listen, I have the unwelcome job of being, you know, like the flight attendant who turns the lights on and wakes everybody up on an overnight flight. I feel like I'm that person now, flipping on the lights saying, we're out of time. We've gotten to we're in final descent, wheels down. The time has flown. I could listen to this conversation for a lot longer, but mindful of everybody's time and appreciative of the weight of that conversation that we just listened to. Let me thank both of you, Tukufu and Pilar, for an incredibly stimulating conversation that, you know, if I had scripted it, you would not only did that, but you surpassed what I was hoping for when we thought about the future of the museum as a decolonized space and what it all means. So there are a couple questions for the questioners whose questions didn't get answered. Know that I have them. I'm going to be sending them to Tukufu and Pilar, who can also see them, and we will have the conversation continue. I don't want to have the last word. Tukufu, Pilar, you have the last word.
Go ahead.
I want to thank you for this opportunity to have this conversation. I told you, Pilar, all we needed to do was start talking, and just the synergy of it would be there. I mean, we are on the edge of changing this thing, and we must be courageous enough to do that. We must be courageous enough to talk about the need for the change and violate. If anybody feels uncomfortable with this conversation, good. We came to make you uncomfortable so that you can go ahead and do something different. If you feel that we are not entitled to have this conversation, good, because now you see that we ain't waiting for you to entitle us to have this conversation. It is taking place. Let us move forward. Let us embrace what it means to be a human as we chart a future where we redefine that to make our world a better place. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Everybody. Pilar, go ahead.
Oh, no, I just want to say thank you. And thank you for this wonderful conversation. I've so enjoyed it. It's been great.
Fantastic. Yes.
The conference will continue. The conversation will continue. Thank you both again, and we will see you down the road. Thanks.
Peace.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.